Today on The Conservative Rebel, the same left-wingers who cheered on when Biden unilaterally tried to buy the votes of millions of college kids with his student loan program are now lecturing us about how the power of the president must be strictly limited. These people are claiming Trump's plan to abolish the education department is somehow unconstitutional. What caused this miraculous conversion? Since when have they pretended to care about the Constitution? To be exact, since noon on Inauguration Day when their political opponent took office. According to them, it's perfectly fine for a president to expand the power of the deep state, but the second he tries to give power back to parents and local communities, he's a dictator. We'll talk about all of that today on The Conservative Rebel. It was back in 2022 when the Democrats had almost complete domination over the government that Joe Biden announced his so-called student loan forgiveness program. The basic idea, we were told, was that the federal government would stretch out its hand and magically make the debt of millions of college kids disappear. That way, they wouldn't have to face the consequences of spending their lives drinking and partying and playing video games and in general being financially irresponsible. And considering the reputation the college kids had made for themselves by being responsible, hardworking, and mature and respectful and in general just wonderful people, they deserved it. That was what we were supposed to believe anyway. In reality, of course, Biden didn't have the supernatural ability to cancel anyone's debt. He could only force middle-class taxpayers who were already struggling to put food on the table and gas in the car to bail out the irresponsible college kids. Biden knew that, or at least his handlers did, but they didn't care, because the point was never to make the lives of college kids easier. The point was to buy millions of votes for the Democrats by essentially bribing young voters into supporting the senile old man in the next election. And if middle-class taxpayers, who the feds never particularly liked anyway, were forced to pay for this scheme, so be it. Biden did all of this without a vote of Congress, even though the Constitution clearly gives Congress the power to control spending. Biden basically just declared that it was happening, whether anyone liked it or not, and to hell with what the Constitution said about it. When the Supreme Court rightly said it was unconstitutional, Biden just ignored them. His administration just continued trying to do everything they could to move their scheme forward, and they were never held accountable for it. The entire time, of course, the media shamelessly sung Biden's praises. They churned out loads of propaganda supporting his student loan scheme. They never pretended to care about the Constitution or about separation of powers or about the limits of the president's power or any of that for 4 whole years. But recently, these people have apparently experienced a miraculous conversion. Now that Trump is in office, these media companies, some of which we're just now learning received millions of dollars in government funding, by the way, are insisting that the president doesn't have the authority to do much of anything at all. He should essentially just be a figurehead. So in just months, these people have gone from praising Biden for ignoring Congress and even the Supreme Court to claiming Trump must get Congress's permission for every little thing, practically, that he tries to do. And one of the most egregious examples is their claim that Trump can't abolish the Department of Education. According to Politico, quote, "The Trump administration is finalizing plans to dismantle the education department through an executive order that would build on the president's campaign promise to hammer the longtime conservative target." The order, which President Trump is expected to sign sometime this month, according to a White House official, was expected to lay out a two-part strategy for shuttering the agency, according to two people familiar with the plans. It would direct the department to craft a plan to wind down its functions using its existing administrative authority. But the order was also expected to call for the agency to inventory a complex set of laws needed to delegate the department's powers to other agencies, and then close the department, an acknowledgement that some of conservatives' biggest desires for change hinge on congressional approval. Such an order would launch a complex initiative. Some conservatives concede they currently lack enough support for legislation to close the department and farm its core functions out to other federal agencies. So Trump apparently doesn't have the power to abolish the education department without Congress, former state media organization Politico tells us. Again, as recently as December, Politico was praising Biden for ignoring Congress and the Supreme Court. The most generous way to look at this is that the people at Politico are just ignorant. They actually think that the president can waste as much money as he wants on almost anything he wants, but the second he tries to save taxpayers some money, he's a tyrant. The other way to look at it is that they're total hacks who don't actually care at all about the Constitution and just want to try to stop the elected president from implementing his agenda, no matter how many lies they have to tell in order to do that. They're trying to get us to believe Trump doesn't have the power to abolish the education department because Congress chartered it, so only Congress allegedly can end it. But all of that is a lie. The education department itself violates the Constitution, especially the 10th Amendment. The Constitution doesn't give the federal government any power at all over education. It protects the rights of the states and the people to control that, along with pretty much everything else. So the law Congress passed, chartering the education department, is an illegitimate law. Trump doesn't have to obey it. In fact, he has a duty to try to undo it by abolishing this agency. He swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, and that means using the power he has to try to rein in the government. Saying Trump has no power to abolish the education department is kind of like saying the Supreme Court has no power to overturn some terrible law Congress passed. The entire reason we have 3 branches of government is so each branch can make sure the others don't misbehave. It's so each branch can stop the unconstitutional activities of the other branches. And guess what? The Constitution gives the president, and the president alone, executive power. It doesn't talk about giving the CIA or the NSA or the Department of Education or EPA or any of these agencies executive power. It only talks about the president, the chief executive. It's right there in the title. The Department of Education is an executive department, so Trump, who is the chief executive, is in charge of it. He can fire anyone he wants who works there, and he can abolish the whole thing even, like he should, and hopefully will, with the stroke of a pen. Of course, the media knows most Americans know absolutely nothing about the Constitution, so it knows it can lie about the Constitution as much as it wants, and most people will believe what it says. But some media outlets aren't just saying Trump can't abolish deep state agencies like the education department. They're shamelessly claiming the founders would support these deep state agencies. Slate ran possibly one of the stupidest articles I've ever seen saying exactly that. Here's the headline: Trump wants to abolish the Department of Education. The founders would have something to say about that. Quote, On Tuesday, multiple outlets reported that the president is preparing an executive order that will encourage the new Secretary of the Department of Education to submit a plan for the agency's wind down and encourage Congress to pass legislation abolishing it. All these moves are supposedly justified by the idea that the federal government does not play a legitimate role in education. But founders like Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison would be confused, if not outraged, by the current administration's disdain for public education and the federal government's role in it. Our founding fathers knew that democracy could not survive without an informed population, and at every turn they called for federal government support of public education. And that support, more than once, has helped transform our democracy for the better. I'm wiping away tears right now. The writing on this is just so powerful. The author of this article is just so eloquent in defending the Department of Education. Yes, it's an impressive collection of butchered out-of-context Founding Fathers quotes someone managed to put together from 5 minutes of thumbing through Google. But before I say anything else, my one question to the author is this: who cares what the founders thought? Who cares? Honest question. Because I clearly remember being told 2 seconds ago that the founders were a bunch of racist, sexist bigots. I clearly remember hearing they were a bunch of unspeakably evil hypocrites who allegedly founded the United States on abstract principles they didn't really believe in. Whatever happened to that? Because that's the thing about the left. 1 second, they're doing everything they possibly can to slander the founders as such racist, sexist bigots that their statues literally need to be ripped to the ground and their names need to be purged from public schools. And then they go from that to the very next second, frantically Googling Founding Fathers quotes so they can shove them in our faces and lecture us about how the founders allegedly supported their education department. They'll seamlessly go from the founders were terrible, whip-cracking slave drivers, nothing they said matters, to how dare you do this, the founders sure wouldn't like it. You know that Thomas Jefferson guy, he sure liked public education. Oh, you mean the same Thomas Jefferson you just called a rapist 4 seconds ago? You mean the Thomas Jefferson whose statue you tore down and vandalized while you chanted about racism with sinister glee? Did you mean anything you said about how terrible the founders were? Were you just lying this whole entire time? Is that what you were doing? Which is it? Were the founders evil, white supremacist supervillains or not? Should we care what they said or not? It's one or the other, so take your pick. Either you lied and we should never trust you again because the founders were actually great statesmen, not supervillains, or you're lying now and we should never trust you again because the founders were supervillains, not great statesmen. And since they were supervillains, who cares what they thought about education? Either you're a liar, in short, or you're a liar. Now it goes without saying that the founders obviously wouldn't support a bureaucracy that violates the same constitution they wrote. But let's leave all that aside for the moment, because there's another argument I want to briefly address. The article is constantly going on and on about how much the founders valued education, as if Trump wants to abolish all education, as if wanting to restore the rights of parents, local governments, and states to decide what will be taught in their own schools is somehow the same thing as wanting to get rid of education altogether. And the writers are just hoping that their readers are too stupid to realize that the two things are completely different, which in the case of Slate might be a safe assumption. So the entire article is essentially one massive straw man argument attacking a position no one on earth holds. No, it's because we want children to be educated that we want this bureaucracy to be abolished, not because we hate education, like you're claiming. This department has pushed radical woke ideology and critical race theory down schools' throats. I think that's why it was created. That's my hypothesis. It was created to give the federal government control over what is taught in classrooms across the country so they can push their agenda. That's not what some other people's hypothesis would be, what the defenders of the department's hypothesis would be. They'd, of course, say that it has an altruistic mission to give children high-quality education, as if that makes it any better. Because actually, if its purpose is to give children high-quality education, things get infinitely worse for you. If its purpose was to indoctrinate a generation of children into the nihilistic Marxist death cult of wokeness, transgenderism, and DEI, we could at least say that the education department was very effective in its mission. We'd hate its mission because its mission would be unspeakably evil, but we'd have to at the very least admit that it was very effective at carrying out that mission. But on the other hand, if its purpose is to give children a high-quality education, we can't even say that, because it has been a catastrophic failure in its mission. According to the most recent data, reading scores are continuing to drop at an alarming rate. Just 2/3 of 4th graders and only 31% of 8th graders can read with any proficiency. That is a disastrously low number, of course. Meanwhile, around 20% of American adults, which would be about 40 million or so, are now considered to have a low literacy level, even though 54% of adults still have literacy level below 6th grade, according to the National Literacy Institute. So things are so bad that apparently those 54% of adults who would struggle to read at a 6th grade level are no longer considered to have low literacy levels in the grand scheme of things. That's apparently normal now. It's totally acceptable for a 40-year-old married man, for example, to be incapable of reading anything more complicated than Harry Potter. At this point, I have to wonder, can the 20% with the so-called low literacy level even read anything at all? 20%? That's probably more than the number of people who don't go to public school. So are you telling me there are some people who go through the whole public school system for years and they can't read? Is that what these statistics are saying? But here's probably the most damning indictment of the education department and the public school system at large that there is. America in 2025 has a lower literacy rate than it did in 1776. America is less literate now, with the vast majority of children being shipped off to public schools for practically their entire childhoods, than it did 250 years ago, when public schools didn't even exist and most people didn't go to any type of school at all. America has a lower literacy now that the feds spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year on education than it did before the federal government even existed. 21% of adults are considered to be illiterate in the US now, if you want to know how bad it is, according to the National Assessment of Adult Literacy. 21% That's well behind 35 other nations, even though we're supposed to be the most powerful and successful and prosperous nation in the world. In 1776, we had the highest literacy rate in the world. We put every country on earth, Britain, France, Spain, all of them, to shame. And we were still just a collection of colonies that hadn't even won their independence yet. Some studies show that America had almost complete literacy at the time of the Revolution, especially in the eastern regions towards the coast where there was more people in bigger cities. Again, we had no public schools of any kind back then. We had no federal government back then. We definitely didn't have a Department of Education back then. And yet the vast majority of people were able to read, write, and do math. John Taylor Gatto, the award-winning teacher and opponent of government education, you may have heard of him, used Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, Common Sense, to show people just how literate the American population was back then. This is what he said, quote, Tom Paine's Common Sense sold 600,000 copies to a population of 2.5 million people, 20% of which was slave, and another 50% indentured. And he was right about those numbers. That's nearly a quarter of the United States who bought that book, counting slaves and indentured servants. And if you want to understand just how remarkable that is, I'm going to read one sentence from that book, Common Sense, to just kind of give you an idea of how complicated it was. We'll see how well we can follow it. So are you ready? We're going to read the sentence now. Quote, as a long and violent abuse of power is generally the means of calling the right of it in question, and in matters too which might never have been thought of, had not the sufferers been aggravated into the inquiry, and as the King of England hath undertaken in his own right to support the Parliament in what he calls theirs, and as the good people of this country are grievously oppressed by the combination, they have an undoubted privilege to inquire into the pretensions of both, and equally to reject the usurpations of either. That is one sentence from that book. Just one sentence. That's longer than most paragraphs would be today. Let me ask you this. How many Americans do you think could read that book today? A book filled with sentences like that. Well, if you look at what grade level Common Sense would be considered nowadays and compare that to the statistics of the grade levels American adults can read at, the number is shockingly low. Only around 10% of American adults could read and understand that book today. That's right, around 25% of Americans bought that book in 1776. And only about 1 in 10 Americans could even understand it in 2025. We have literally gone from the most literate and intelligent nation on earth to a country of absolute morons who don't know how to think for themselves. A country where the rising generation spends all their free time zombified on the couch, watching TikTok reels or whatever while they stuff their faces full of Pringles, just mindlessly glued to the shiny, flashing screen like fruit flies hovering around a light. Most people back then were light years ahead of most people right now. What does that tell you about our education system? So if we have a population that doesn't know how to think for itself, a population that couldn't manage to read any worthwhile book if their lives depended on it, what in heaven's name do we have a Department of Education for? What is its purpose? Why does it exist? Why have American taxpayers been forced to pay hundreds of billions of dollars to keep this thing running? Are you telling me that the same bureaucracy you claim we can't afford to get rid of is so incompetent and ineffective and stupid that even though we give it hundreds of billions of dollars a year to spend on education, kids keep getting dumber? Is that what you're telling me? How much more money do we have to throw on this fire before we start getting some results? 100 billion more? 500 billion more? 1 trillion more? How much taxpayer money will it take? How much money do we have to surrender to the geniuses at the education department before we can expect, I don't know, that kids will be able to read? So the issue is not that the Department of Education doesn't have enough funding, like we're supposed to believe. The issue is that the Department of Education exists in the first place. Lighting hundreds of billions of dollars more on fire and hoping things magically get better is not going to fix anything. How's that worked out for you the past 40 years? We spend hundreds of billions on this institution, and we still get a nation of morons that seems to get stupider and stupider every year. We don't need to feed this Department of Education beast even more meat than it already has. Instead, we need to kill the beast. We need to bring control over education back to the states, back to local communities, and most of all, back to the parents of the kids who are being taught in the schools. With Donald Trump in the White House, we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to finally get this done. I suggest we take it, because Donald Trump, like many Americans, doesn't care what Politico and Slate or any other media company thinks anymore. He's not asking for their permission to implement his agenda. And if Trump comes through on this and really does abolish the education department, it will be one of the most important victories for parents, for education, for liberty, and for sanity that we've had in a long time. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Conservative Rebel. I'll see you on the next episode.